Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Of course, that's my usual greeting, right? You're probably tired of hearing it, but this is the limitation of Chamorro rights and foreign affairs. So, limitation of Chamorro rights, of course, where we actually like covered some of that, but we're actually going to cover so much more of that. Like, you're probably thinking right now, like, wow, sir, there's actually like, isn't that enough already? Like the limitation on the rights, on the Chamorro rights by that time? Well, unfortunately, that's not it yet. There's going to be so much more limitation on the rights, and a lot of these limitation on the rights that time still exists until today. And foreign affairs, of course, you're probably like wondering, like, okay, so what we know so far, like, it's about World War II, right? So how's that whole situation going to happen? What are the things that's going to lead up to that? And that's what we're going to cover today. So objectives, of course, like what I mentioned in the previous video, you probably noticed like how I didn't cover the hospital and all that stuff. We're gonna cover that today. Explain the modernization and why the modernization had its own good and bad effects on the island. So I mentioned about modernization about 2 weeks ago and why it had its own good and bad things. When we're actually like we're going to like elaborate further on that today. Explain the connection of world issues to the island. So recap: Richard Leary becomes the first governor of Guam. Filipino-American War begins, and it will end in 1902. Apolinario Mabini banished to Guam because he fought against the Americans. Did not agree with them. Shotan, I'm not really sure if it's Shotan or Shotan, but I'm just gonna call him Shotan. Schroeder changes back a lot of laws, but the Germans also arrived in Guam and would stay in here. Those 300 Germans, and that explains why some Chamorros are also part Germans. Only some. That's like a very little, like in terms of the population. The Japanese will capture Micronesia from the Germans, and World War One will end. So the first part that we're gonna learn today is about the Susanna Hospital. That's today's naval base. And before I start on that topic, I would just like to introduce to you this one scholar. Her name is Anna Torrey. She is the first Chamorro woman with a PhD. That's super amazing, right? She's actually the first one to do that, and to be able to do that means it also broke a lot of barriers within the community. Like, wow, like women can actually do these things, right? And she proved that to everybody. And that time, like when like back in the past, there's a lot of like sexism going on, where a lot more people look down on women. Now she proved to everybody that women can do the same things that men can do, or if not better, right? And she currently teaches Guam history in the University of Guam. Yes, I had her as my professor. She's also one of the most popular scholars here in Guam and throughout Micronesia. So you probably remember her if you did that assignment about the Guam figures, like back in week number 1 or week number 2. But anyway, she is that popular. Almost every adult here in Guam knows about her because she is that popular. And she's a really, really amazing human being, by the way. And she's the writer of the many things that we learned so far, right? And let me tell you the truth. A lot of my knowledge about Guam history came from her. So I would like to credit her for all of that. So I do have a picture with her, of course. I don't have like a one, like just me and her picture, but I do have this picture, all of us together. So this was during the ARC conference. And of course, this is me eating a pizza, and this is her right here. And this is my other professor, US history, Dr. Platt. And another Guam history professor who also taught me a lot. And two of my classmates who are also teachers today. So I just wanted to show you that picture to let you know how much, how basically how proud I am to have had her as a professor. And I'm really a really proud student that took her class. So, by the way, the reason why I mentioned her is, of course, because of this part over here, the Susanna Hospital. She wrote this one long article, not really that long, of course, but it's like 20 page or 30 page article, and she was talking about the treatment of the American towards the Chamorros, and Of course, she did a lot of research on that since she's a scholar and all that stuff. But anyway, we're going to learn in the next few slides how the Americans treated the Chamorros in the Susana Hospital. And of course, if you remember in the past, this was established by Schroeder, Governor Schroeder, and was required to give healthcare to anyone who needed it. Like Schroeder actually cared about the Chamorros, right? Remember? And so he wanted to build this thing. So in like just for everyone to get treated, whether it could be a minor or major sickness. And now this is now today's Naval Hospital. If you're not sure where it is, this is actually in Agana Heights. And for those people that join sports, if you travel to already to Guam High, and you probably like pass by this place already. But if you live near the area, you definitely know this place. But by the way, Naval Hospital used to be called the Susana Hospital. So what was the purpose of this? Of course, to treat locals, right? And also to treat military members that would come here just in case they were wounded. But at the time, there was no war, so of course, there were not that much people that were coming here for their wounds or something. But just in case a war would break up, right? Or would break out. And to treat passing by military members that often come from Philippines, US, or somewhere else. Like what I said, minor or major type of treatment. To show that Guam has now become modernized with a hospital, with schools and other things. So this was also a way to show that American presence here in Guam was beneficial. And because of American presence here in Guam, everything is becoming more modern and becoming new. We have new hospital, we have a new school, and we have everything else that is new. And just like what the Americans have, we have the same kind of things, right? And this also shows that most military members and their families settled in Agana or Agana Heights. So I probably never mentioned this to you before, but during the Spanish Empire, when the Spanish were still here, most of the highest rank Chamorros and most of the families of the military members were actually settling in Agana. And that's one thing I just wanted to mention because it was also the same thing with the Americans. That's where they mostly settled in Agana. So that's why they decided to build the hospital in Agana. So that makes much more sense, right? So Susana Hospital, there were these Chamorro nurses. So there's a picture of it. And this is like a white nurse, another white nurse over here. But they often work as housekeeper. They're not given much opportunity to learn about medicine the same level of the whites. Of course, they were given the basic things about medicine. Well, of course, we can just have an idea like what they did. But most of the time, they were there to clean, like after the white nurses do their jobs. So what is the purpose of all that training, right? They actually like, to tell you the truth, before the Chamorros were able to enter the hospital, they actually trained in some type of nursing school. And this was a portrait or a picture of that nursing school. But anyway, they had to go through all that training just to end up as a housekeeper, right? And what was the reason for that? Unfortunately, again, is due to social hierarchy, due to skin color. Social hierarchy in the hospital based on race. So, of course, the white nurses are the highest, right? The treatment towards the Chamorro nurses were not exactly good, although it depends to person to person. Of course, that's actually like it depends from person to person, right? We cannot say like everybody there in the hospital treated them badly, but I think that we can say for sure that a lot of them were treated as housekeepers. A lot of women felt belittled every time they work in hospitals. Like some of them, like, oh, I don't feel like coming to work today just to be belittled by someone. A lot of them felt that today, well, that day, I mean, sorry about it. And while others felt that it was such a good opportunity to serve the society better or to be in higher social hierarchy. So that time, it was like if you're someone that served in the Susana Hospital, you were like in a better hierarchy level. Like it was something that you can brag about. That's why like I heard that some Chamorros also like when they had an experience with the Susana Hospital, that's one of the things that they actually mentioned. And it could be like either bragging rights or it could be something that like some type of horror story that they wanted to tell people. But other way, there was so much things that happened in that hospital, and the hospital, like what I said, still exists today, and it's now called the Naval Base. So now we saw the limitations of like the rights of the Chamorros in the hospital, right? And now we're going to see more of those limitations, and now the economy. So this is the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. This is also called the Jones Act of 1920. So what did this do? Like, sir, why are we talking about another law, right? Well, let me tell you why. This is super important because this thing still applies until today. And you're going to be like mind blown with what actually this means to us. So at this time, one of the main arguments in America was about income taxes and how to tax the territories. Like they're wondering, like, okay, so these are territories. So what are we gonna do with them? What are we gonna do with Guam? There's no much, how much resources there in Guam. So what are they gonna do in Guam? So they're like, okay, let's come up with a law that would restrict this trade. And I'm going to explain to you more on how that works. So the Congress eventually decided to require all ships heading to Puerto Rico to pass by US first before it could get to Puerto Rico. This way, the US can tax the ships and also the goods. So that time, this is how it was originally meant to be. So Puerto Rico could ask for, let's say, sugar, right, from China. And China would ship out the sugar. But the sugar wouldn't go straight to Puerto Rico. It has to go straight to California first. And then since it will arrive to California, it could be taxed. So now Puerto Rico has to pay for that expenses, or it's either Puerto Rico or the shipping companies. And now when it gets to Puerto Rico, the sugar gets to Puerto Rico, everything gets really expensive. All that sugar gets really expensive. And that is the same situation here in Guam today. Today, let me tell you how it works. So now let's say you're trying to order from Amazon, right? Let's say you ordered a book or maybe a laptop from Amazon. And let's say it came from Japan, right? So do you really think that just because you ordered in Japan and then Japan is so close, it's just going to arrive in 3 days? Unfortunately not, because it has to pass by the US ships. So this is how it's going to be today. It has to go to Hawaii first. Like Japan will send your item and then has to pass by to Hawaii. And then from Hawaii, it will arrive to Guam. And that is why we have such an expensive shipping here in Guam. And the shipping also comes with taxes. That's why everything else is overpriced. And that also applies to food. That also applies to everything else. So effective with the law to Guam until today. This is the reason why everything in Guam is so expensive. Don't you ever wonder that, right? Why is everything in Guam so expensive? So if you're someone that's been to states like Las Vegas, like Seattle, or even the western states, right? Actually, the southern states are the cheapest one and the northwest. But anyway, let me tell you this. A lot of those states are so much cheaper than Guam. And you're probably wondering like, hey, why is this? Why is it like that? Like those states are bigger, they have bigger population, right? And it was actually because of that law. Because everything that comes to Guam has to pass by Hawaii, so it has to be taxed. That's why everything is so expensive. And that includes gas, food, cars, clothes, tools, spam, or etc. You ever notice like on TV it says like, oh, Taco Bell, like one taco is like $1, right? And then when you buy it there in Guam, it's like plus 300%. It's because of this law. And then don't you ever wonder about Jollibee, right? Let's say Jollibee's your favorite restaurant here in Guam. And you know, like Jollibee in Philippines is so cheap, right? And whenever they ship their items here in Guam, let's say it comes from Philippines, it has to go to Hawaii also. That's why when it arrives here in Guam, your 40 pesos or $1 burger in Philippines, it turns into a 2.99 burger. That's how it happens all the time. And this is why Everything is so expensive here in Guam. And sir, what about houses? Well, because of our economic standpoint, houses are also expensive. Well, of course, houses are not shipped, right? How can you really ship a house? But anyway, that's also because of this economic law. So this time, this is what Woodrow Wilson, the president that time said. Or this is like something that was talked about again, like about him. So let me just read this out for you. The Jones Act, signed by Woodrow Wilson in 1917, requires that domestic shipping to Puerto Rico be conducted by U.S. owned, U.S. made ships staffed by American crew. So now, those American crew will have to get paid for anything that is shipped to Puerto Rico. All food from the mainland, 85% of what it consumes, must be brought on U.S. ships. It costs an estimated $3,063 to ship a 20-foot container of household and commercial goods from the East Coast to Puerto Rico. The same shipment costs $1,500 for to nearby Dominican Republic. The Jones Act is a continuation of our colonial relationship. So this is more like something that's anti-colonial, but of course I'm not really agreeing to anything, right? You know me, I don't agree to anything, but anyway, this is just a point of view that's criticizing this Jones Act. And it's up to you. Like, do you really want to support this or do you really want to be against this? But let me tell you what's also wrong with this. You know, like how Puerto Rico receives like $4 billion a year, right? If you think about it, that's a lot of money. And like they're receiving like Pell Grants for free college, economic assistance, Medicaid, WIC, Social Security, benefits, and all that stuff. Wow, US is so awesome. We're receiving a lot of money from them. But check this out. This is the amount of money that the United States make because of Puerto Rico and because of the Merchant Marine Act. Because of that Merchant Marine Act being applied to Puerto Rico, not only to Puerto Rico and also Guam, US makes more than $74 billion. So who's now the winner in this? Puerto Rico receiving a lot of aid, like $4 billion, or the US making $74 billion from Puerto Rico? This is the exact situation here in Guam. I'm not really sure how much Guam gets from the United States every year, but let's say Guam earns like, makes like, or gets like $2 billion or maybe $5 billion because of the military, right? But US could be making like $50 billion because of Guam, because of this law over here. And this is why a lot of people believe that we should get rid of this law. So that time, you know, like how World War I was just done, right? And everything here that we talk about happened in the 1920s. So now, what's happening in the world? World War I is done. So the thing is, all countries that fought in World War I, they were like deciding on how to prevent another World War from happening. They were like all saying that, okay, we don't want another war from happening, so how could we do this? So they decided on limiting each naval capabilities to prevent another world war. Like, okay, we should limit on how strong our Navy could get. So they made these treaties in the Washington Disarmament Conference. This actually lasted for a year. So the first treaty that they had was the Four-Power Treaty. It was agreed on by the US, UK, Japan, and France to not expand their territories in the Pacific anymore. So what could this mean to Guam? Well, that means that Japan cannot step over Guam because it's owned by the US. And Japan is not allowed to expand its territory to the Pacific anymore. And you're going to find out this actually upsets Japan because they're saying like, oh, okay, so why are we not allowed to take any more territories in the Pacific? Like, we're Asians, these are for us, right? So they were really upset about this. And that's one of the reasons why they would eventually attack the US. That would start the US to join to the World War II. I know that sentence didn't make sense, but you can have an idea what I just said. But anyway, the next one was Five-Power Treaty. It was agreed upon that all powerful countries would limit their naval power in the following ratio: Britain 5 tons, US 5, Japan 5, France 1.67, and Italy 1.67. By the way, sorry, I made a mistake over here, but this is actually 3. So Britain get 5 tons, US get 5 tons, Japan only gets 3. France 1.67 and Italy 1.67. But anyway, these are not like that strong in the naval power, but this also made Japan mad. So like Japan will be like, so now you told us that we cannot take any more Pacific territories other than Micronesia, and now you're telling us to make our navy weak? That would also fuel Japan to start World War II later on. But of course, they didn't start it yet because this was only 1921. And the next one was the Nine Power Treaty, signed by US, Britain, Japan, France, Italy, Netherlands, Portugal, Belgium, and China to make sure that China had its freedom and sovereignty. So now, you know that these treaties right here would upset Japan, right? So how would this upset Japan also? What do you think? Let me tell you this. Japan wanted China because of this resources. So now, since they signed this treaty, Japan cannot get China anymore, cannot invade China anymore. And that's why Japan would also be angry and would eventually start World War II because it wants China. So you can see already what's going to happen in the future. And this was only 1921. And you can already see that Japan was already angry with a lot of the treaties that were pretty much kind of placed against them. So what does Guam have to do with this? So like I kind of mentioned this earlier, it means that Guam will be left alone by Germany and Japan, the 2 countries that tried to take over Micronesia. It solidified Japanese holdings on Micronesia besides Guam, so that like made everything valid. And the US knew that Japan would eventually become a threat to Guam and all of the territories. Very prophetic, huh? Because this time, all these countries knew that Japan was upset. They did not like this treaty. So now, these are the side effects of this treaty. Actually, this is the side effect of World War I overall to Japan and Germany. And let me give you a spoiler. The 2 countries that will start World War II are Japan and Germany. And Japan would start that war, right? And Japan and Germany would be allies. But anyway, they are the ones that will start World War II. So Japan will be upset with the limitations that the US and other countries put on them, since they really wanted to improve and increase the amount of ships they have. They also had an interest in Guam and Philippines. Asian inspirations. Japan also had a strong interest in China and its resources. But now, because of these treaties, they cannot apply those interests anymore. And this is another thing also. Germany, their economy fell due to the amount of debts imposed on them by the Allied forces. So after World War I, all of the Allied forces decided to blame the war on Germany, although Germany did not start the war. And that time, Hitler was saying, because Hitler that time was not really a high type of human being yet, like he wasn't really recognized yet and all that stuff. But he kept saying like, okay, let's blame these specific group of people, and we should like change our like political system overall, which is switch to fascism and all that stuff. But the thing is, he was jailed that time. And 7 years later, everybody in Germany was like, okay, actually, maybe Hitler was right. So now they elected Hitler as the Chancellor of Germany, and later on would become the Führer, meaning the supreme leader of Germany. But of course, these are not related to Guam history, but it actually also relates to Guam history because these are the like these are the tensions that were building up, and you know, like Guam has to do a lot with like World War II, and these are the tensions that were building up with the countries that started World War II because of these treaties over here that they found unfair. So let me tell you what was happening now. So this is still 1920s, right? And Japan was in Micronesia. And the thing is, if you ask a lot of people like what they think about the Japanese treatment about like towards the Chamorros, they thought that oh, it was bad, right? But the thing is, the opinions of the people that time were actually different. And most of the opinions that we hear from our manamkus are actually because that's what they saw when they were young. But older Micronesians and Chamorros like knew that the Japanese were different. So let me just talk about how the Japanese treated the Chukis and the Pohnpeians and the Yapis and the Palauans and the Kusrainas, of course. And this there was this one document written by Lynn Poyer. This is her right here. I know the picture is very blurry, but she was talking about how the Japanese were actually nice towards the Micronesians at first, including the Chamorros in the Marianas Islands. And the thing is, this is how it happened. This is why the Japanese became really bad in the end. So, like in 1920s, there was no warrior, right? The World War One just ended. But in the 1930s, the Japanese started to become more aggressive because they were already preparing for war. And now, towards the end of World War II, that's when the Japanese became really harsh to the Micronesians overall, whether you may be from Carolinians or whether you may be Chamorro. That's when they started to become harsh because they were losing the war. Most of the people that witnessed those were young children at that time. And today, they're the old people today, of course, right? And that's like 80 years ago already. And that's why the common narrative today is the Japanese were bad. Of course, I'm not trying to defend the Japanese, right? And of course, this is controversial to say. But anyway, overall, if you look at the historical books, the Japanese did not treat everybody wrong the whole time. They mostly treated them at the end of the war. Okay? I just wanted to clarify that. And I'm not trying to protect anyone here. I'm just trying to clear up what really happened in the Japanese treatment and here in Micronesia. So a lot of the Carolinians actually appreciated the Japanese. And in Palau, they actually they married, they even intermarried with the Japanese, and also same thing for the other Caroline Islands. And let me tell you this in advance, like a lot of Palauans will actually enlist in World War II to fight for the Japanese, because a lot of them, of course, were now children of the Japanese because of this intermarriage that happened in 1920s and so forth. So why am I mentioning this in Guam history class? This is because this is our neighbors and this was happening around us. Objectives. Explain why the modernization has its own good and bad effects on the island. So we talk about the Susana Hospital, and it's up to you like whether the whole situation was good or bad. And of course, you can make your own judgment. Explain the connection of the world issues to the island. So we talk about the issues of World War One. We talk about the Jones Act. We talk about how Japan would react to this. So all these issues would eventually lead up to World War II, and that's why it relates to Guam. All right. So by the way, again, you have another worksheet that is due after you watch this video. So make sure to do that worksheet and complete it. Okay. If you have any question, please let me know. Other than that, please finish your worksheet and make sure to submit it to me. And have a good day or have a good night.